Hello and welcome back to Modern World History. In this video, we're going to continue our discussion about imperialism, this time focusing a little bit more on the Western Hemisphere, looking at the United States. Now, remember, Latin American countries had already had their independence movements. All of them were pretty violent and pretty bloody except for Brazil. We already talked about it in one of our earlier videos for an earlier unit. But at this point in the course, they're trying to pick up the pieces. They're trying to repair themselves after their wars of independence. And there's economic problems that have emerged and that are continuing to emerge in this region. So part of this is because once the movements for independence were established, the land that formerly had belonged to the Catholic Church, much of that land was sold, and they were sold for relatively high prices. Here's the deal. Only your rich landowners are able to afford the cost of that land. And so they bought up all this land, and then they really have no idea how to use that land effectively. And this is going to be a problem. This is going to be an ongoing issue we're going to see in some of these Latin American countries. And so this also kind of brings about a little bit of political instability. All right, so in the midst of all of this, these caudillos, which are dictators, emerge, and they take basically all power. And the landowners here actually support the caudillos. So if we come over here, caudillos were pretty unopposed because of this. Latin America's had no experience with democracy anyway, and so they were kind of used to the idea of powerful dictators. And also Latin Americans had an agricultural economy centered on exports to Britain and the United States. So the landowners wanted to stay wealthy. They wanted to keep people farming more or less. And so this also led to issues of non-industrialization. They didn't have any industries in Latin America. They were just mainly agrarian farmers that exported their goods to Europe in order to get manufacturers brought back to Latin America. So they borrowed tons of money from Europe and through all of this as well to add to the economic issues that were happening. And Europeans began to threaten force. Say, hey, we're going to come over and forcefully get our money back if you guys don't get together and start paying up. So once this started to happen, the United States starts to kind of pay attention, and they're thinking, we're not going to let this happen. We want to keep Europeans out of the Western Hemisphere. And so this is where, in 1823, you get this Monroe Doctrine, named after President James Monroe. And I'm going to quote right here what he says, more or less. It kind of sums up the idea behind the Monroe Doctrine. As a principle in which the rights and interests of the United States are involved, that the American continents, by the free and independent condition which they have assumed and maintained, are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers. He's basically saying, stay out to the Europeans. All right, he doesn't want them in here anywhere. Stay away from Latin America. Cuba was still controlled by the Spanish at this point. All right, so Cuba was their last American colony, and the United States had started to gain a huge economic tie to Cuba. They were financially intertwined with Cuba. So there was a money factor here that made Cuba worthwhile for the United States to make sure that they were willing to do. Now, the Cubans had also fought a series of wars against the Spanish in order to get their independence. And after the most recent one, I would say probably by the 1880s or so, the United States had established a strong economic tie with Cuba, like we have here. By 1890, the United States begins to justify involvement in Cuba's affairs in order to remove the Spanish due to the use of concentration camps. Now, again, this is really just a justification, a means to an end, to look back at Machiavelli from the beginning of the course. But the United States is going to use this as a justification for going to war with Spain, and they knew they were going to obliterate them. They knew they were going to win this war. So the war lasted only 4 months, very, very short little war, in the words of Teddy Roosevelt. But the United States humiliates Spain. I mean, they beat them senselessly. And what they did was, after they went after Cuba, the United States, they have kind of a global proximity as well to the Philippines. They ended up going and attacking the Philippines as well, which divided Spain between Cuba in the west and the Philippines in the east. And so they were able to go in and easily overwhelm the Spanish, and yay, Cuba is free. Well, are they though? You see, here's the thing, is that even though by name and by title Cuba had become a free country, the United States had essentially replaced the Spanish as imperialists here, because what they're going to do is they're going to establish a military dictatorship over Cuba, and then they're going to continue to try and control the political situation there for their own economic good. And so many of the Cubans began to resent American interference because of that. In the Philippines, it also went to the United States, as did Puerto Rico and Guam and all these other island territories that belonged to Spain. Cuba was not okay with the switch. Emilio Aguinaldo had declared Philippines a republic, but the United States actually fought nationalists. All right, so they opposed after they beat the Spanish and the Philippines. They were pretty excited about the idea of being an independent nation. But once the United States defeated the Spanish, they began to fight against the nationalists in order to establish a more favorable economic situation for them, just like what we were seeing in Cuba. And so the United States defeated the nationalists and promised to prepare them still for self-rule. But in reality, they built up infrastructure, which is great, but they established a cash crop-centered agricultural economy, which means that people were growing crops that could be sold cheaply to Americans at the expense of their own people and their own livelihood, their own ability to grow food for their families. And so people starved as a result of this. So again, kind of like a trade one imperialist for another. In addition to Cuba and the Philippines, the United States had also set their sights on Hawaii, because Hawaii served as a port that was kind of along the way to China. It also, starting in the early 1800s, around 1820s or so, had become a place where sugar had begun to be grown, and it was incredibly profitable at that point. And so a lot of times these wealthy planters would go in and they establish these sugar plantations in Hawaii, and in doing so they gained so much wealth, owned so much land, and actually began to gain political power in Hawaii. Now, this was at the expense of native Hawaiians. But then all of a sudden there's the McKinley Tariff Act near the end of the century that was passed, and it excluded all tariffs on sugar entering the United States. Now remember, Hawaii at this point is not a part of the United States. And so once you exclude all tariffs, then sugar that's being produced closer than Hawaii is now going to be cheaper to import into the United States than to get sugar imported from Hawaii. And so it cut into the profits of the landowners that were planting this sugar in Hawaii. And so they started to say, hey, well, what we need to do then is we need to take over Hawaii and then allow it to be annexed by the United States, so that then we could get back in being in good standing where we have the cheapest sugar in the land. And so this right here was kind of the plan that some of these landowners had established, and they actually were able to essentially pull it off, because by 1893, some of these plantation owners actually removed Queen Liliuokalani from power and established the Republic of Hawaii. Alright, and so then they promptly asked the United States to annex it, and by 1898, the United States, in fact, did annex this because it was profitable for them. And so that's kind of Hawaii and how that ended up. The United States, again, using the idea behind the economic gains that they could establish by imposing rules like the Monroe Doctrine and by economic imperialism, more or less, they decided that it would be extremely profitable for them to I guess, help out with the construction of this canal that would make it so you didn't have to go all the way around South America in order to get from east to west. And so the United States wanted to help head this up, and it's no easy task. The French had already tried, and they failed to do this. It was not something they were able to pull off. And also, Panama at the time belonged to Colombia, and so the United States offered $10 million a year to build this construction project, but Colombia actually wanted more than this. So the United States, they started to try to encourage Panama to revolt against their government there, and so by 1903, the United States had kind of pulled that off by interfering in the political system here. Panama becomes a free country, and the Panama Canal was what it should say. This should say started by 1904. So the project began to be created by 1904, right after this movement for independence, where the people of Panama became free. And so here's the way this worked out. It took 10 years to actually construct the canal, and it also was an incredible project. If you read this little segment here, it comes right out of the book. During the construction of the canal, the workers dug up more than 200 million cubic yards of earth. That's a ton. You got thousands of workers dying of diseases and things. So the conditions by which it was being built was incredibly bad. But then if you look at the endeavor and what this enabled, there's a lot of interaction that goes through this canal. It's an incredibly important thing that really helped exchange goods and ideas across the world as a whole. So it really is a major engineering feat. I'm not saying it wasn't without consequences for sure, but nonetheless a very impressive project. The Roosevelt Corollary then was really kind of a part 2 of the Monroe Doctrine. So the Monroe Doctrine we talked about just now was this idea that countries had to stay out. European countries had to stay out of American affairs. Anything that happened in the Western Hemisphere was under the United States, or they didn't want Europe messing with that stuff. But then part 2 here, the Roosevelt Corollary, is going to be establishing the United States as a police power in the Western Hemisphere. And so this one, again, kind of restates the idea that Europeans are going to stay out of what's going on in the West. But number 2, it also kind of served as a justification for future U.S. interventions in the event that they needed to, I guess, protect their own economic interests in the West. So that wraps it up for the United States involvement during the imperialism period. And in the next video, we're going to start talking about Asia. Thanks for watching.